Steve Harvey is really out here still talking about Katt Williams. And girl, at this point, it's starting to feel personal. Like, how are we 2 whole years past that interview and this man is still pressed? Sit down, let me tell you properly, because this whole situation is messy in a way that just keeps unfolding. So basically, Steve went on a podcast recently acting like Katt is just some bitter, jealous guy who can't handle not being on his level. And you know how Steve talks very confident, very I'm above this. But the thing is, if you're really above it, why are you still talking about it? That's what's not adding up. Because remember when Katt did that interview, he didn't just throw random jokes. He was calling people out by name, talking about how the industry works behind the scenes. And one of the wildest things he said was about this so-called program. Like, if you want to make it big, there's a certain image you have to fit into. And part of that image, a very specific type of wife. And that's where Marjorie Harvey comes in. Now, Katt didn't just casually mention Marjorie. He basically implied that women like her are part of this whole system. Like, you don't just randomly end up with that exact same type of partner unless it's arranged in some way. And he didn't say it once. He doubled down and said it applies to multiple men in the industry. So when people heard that, they were like, wait, what? Because think about it. Marjorie has always been very low key when it comes to interviews. You don't really see her sitting down explaining her side of anything. She's always just there looking polished, living the lifestyle, but not really speaking. And Katt basically turned that into a whole theory. Now, fast forward, Steve starts responding. And not just responding, he gets heated. Like, threatening level heated. Talking about how he still has hands, even if they're slow now. And that's when people started side-eyeing him. Because let's be real, nobody threatens like that unless something hit a nerve. And here's where it gets even messier. There are whispers, and I'm saying whispers, okay, but they're loud enough, that Marjorie is actually the one pushing Steve to keep addressing Katt. Like, she's the one behind the scenes saying, you need to respond to this. And suddenly the whole dynamic starts looking different. Instead of Steve being this calm, collected guy above drama, it starts to feel like he's reacting almost on command, like someone is pulling the strings and he's just executing. And that's exactly what Katt was hinting at. He straight up painted Marjorie as the one in control. Not just in their relationship, but in how Steve moves publicly too. Like, she's the one guiding the narrative, deciding what gets said, what gets addressed, and how it all plays out. And then he didn't stop there. He brought up Steve's past. And girl, that's where things start getting uncomfortable. Because Steve loves to talk about Marjorie like she's the woman who changed his life, right? Like, she came in and helped build him into who he is today. But Katt was like, hold on, didn't you say that about your first wife too? And now people are like, wait a minute, because the timeline doesn't look clean at all. When Steve first met Marjorie, he was already married. That's not speculation, that's just fact. And there's even that story they both tell about the moment they met, her walking into a comedy club late, him stopping the show just to stare at her and then saying, I'm going to marry her. Cute story, but also very convenient. Because what happened after that wasn't some fairy tale, they didn't just ride off into the sunset. They dated for a bit, then suddenly she disappeared. And according to what people say, it had a lot to do with Steve not being financially where he is now. Then years later, after he gets successful, after the sitcom, after the money is right, boom, she's back. And this time, everything sticks. Now, tell me that doesn't raise questions. And on top of that, Steve was still married to his second wife, Mary Shackelford, when things started reconnecting with Marjorie. Mary herself has spoken about how fast everything moved, how it felt like she was pushed out while Marjorie stepped in. And the way Mary describes it, it's not pretty. She talks about losing everything, her home, her financial stability, even her relationship with her son. And she blames Steve for manipulating the situation, controlling the narrative, and basically turning everything against her. But here's the twist people keep bringing up. What if Steve wasn't even the mastermind behind all of that? What if Marjorie was? And see, that's exactly where the conversation starts getting a little darker, because now people aren't just questioning Steve anymore. They're looking straight at Marjorie Harvey like, wait, what is your role in all of this? Because when Mary Shackelford started speaking out, she didn't just say Steve moved on quickly. She described a whole situation where she felt pushed out, like decisions were being made around her, not with her. She talked about losing her home, her businesses, even her financial footing all at once. And the part that really hit people, she said her son was taken from her and turned against her. Now listen, whenever court situations get involved, there's always two sides. But the way Mary tells it, she felt completely outplayed. Like everything was orchestrated in a way that left her with nothing, while Steve and Marjorie stepped into this new perfect public image. And that's where people start connecting dots that maybe weren't obvious before, because Katt didn't just randomly call Marjorie a puppet master. He made it sound like she's strategic, like she sees the bigger picture, plays the long game, and positions herself exactly where she needs to be. And when you look at how things unfolded, you kind of see why people are even entertaining that idea. Now let's talk about Marjorie before Steve, because this is where the story gets even more layered. Before she was living this polished luxury life, she was in a completely different world. Her first husband was Jim Townsend, and this wasn't just some random guy. He was deep in serious business, the kind that brings federal attention. There have been claims that authorities had their eyes on her too. Not charged, not convicted, but definitely not invisible. And allegedly, there was a moment where Jim had to make a choice: cooperate or risk Marjorie getting pulled into everything as well. Now he ends up taking the fall, gets sentenced, spends decades locked up, and eventually gets out years later. But Marjorie, she walks away clean, no charges, no case, just files for divorce and moves on with her life. And people were like, how does that happen? Then right after that, she ends up with another man, Darnell Woods, who also ends up getting caught up in similar trouble. And again, history repeats itself. He gets arrested, serves time, and Marjorie moves on. Now, I'm not saying anything directly, but when patterns start repeating like that, people notice. And this is where Katt's narrative starts hitting differently, because he's basically saying Marjorie doesn't just stumble into situations, she positions herself. So when she reconnects with Steve in 2005, it's not the same struggling comedian she met years ago. This is a man with a hit show, money flowing in, a career that's about to explode. And suddenly everything aligns perfectly. They get married in 2007. And just like that, the image is set. Power couple, blended family motivational speeches, relationship advice on TV, the whole package. But behind that polished image, insiders have been hinting that things aren't as smooth as they look. There are whispers that Marjorie runs the household completely, not just small influence, full control. Like she decides how things move, how the family is presented, even how Steve responds publicly to situations. And then comes the part involving Lori Harvey, because apparently Marjorie is very focused on Lori's image and relationships, like she's guiding her on how to move, who to date, how to maintain a certain lifestyle. And when Lori was with Michael B. Jordan, things looked serious for a minute. People were even saying he was ready to settle down, maybe even propose. But then the whole prenup conversation came up, which honestly is normal at that level. But the story going around is that Marjorie wasn't having it, like completely shut it down. And not long after that, Lori and Michael split. Now, again, nobody is sitting there confirming every detail, but when these stories keep stacking up, it creates a picture, a very specific picture, one where Marjorie isn't just a supportive wife in the background, she's actively shaping everything. And that brings us right back to Katt. Because when he called all of this out, people laughed at first. They thought it was just another comedian going off, stirring drama. But now 2 years later, the fact that Steve is still reacting, still responding, still throwing little shots, it's making people rethink everything. Because if none of it was true, why not just ignore it completely? Why keep bringing it up? Why keep giving it energy? And more importantly, why does it feel like every time Steve speaks, he's not just defending himself, he's defending something bigger, something that clearly got under his skin way more than he wants to admit? And that's the part people can't shake, because it's not just about Steve Harvey being annoyed anymore. It's about why this is still bothering him this deeply. Like, you can hear it in the way he talks. It's not calm. It's not dismissive. It's personal. And when something is that personal, people start asking, what exactly is he protecting? Because if Katt Williams was just talking nonsense, this would have died a long time ago. But instead, every time Steve gets on a mic, he circles back to it. He keeps trying to frame Katt as jealous, as bitter, as someone grieving success he doesn't have. And sure, that sounds good on the surface, but it doesn't explain the reaction. Because let's be honest, if someone you don't respect says something wild about you, you laugh it off. You don't threaten them. You don't keep revisiting it years later. You don't keep trying to prove something. And that's why people keep going back to what Katt originally said, because he wasn't just throwing jokes. He was questioning the whole structure behind how certain people rise in that industry. And whether you believe him or not, he planted a seed that hasn't gone away. Now bring Marjorie Harvey back into this, because this is where everything connects. The more people look into her past, her relationships, the timing of everything, the more it feeds into that idea that she's not just along for the ride. She's steering it, and it's not even just about her past marriages anymore. It's about how everything lines up so cleanly in the present. The image, the brand, the lifestyle, the way the family is presented to the public, it's all very controlled, very polished, almost too perfect. And then you hear insiders saying there's tension behind the scenes, that not everything is as united as it looks, that there are dynamics in that house where Marjorie has the final say, where she decides what's acceptable, what's beneficial, what fits the image. So when Steve goes out and responds to Katt, people are now watching differently. They're not just hearing his words, they're reading between them. They're asking, is this really Steve talking, or is this a response that had to happen? And that's why the puppet narrative keeps coming up, because it's not about disrespecting Steve. It's about the possibility that he's not as independent in these situations as he presents himself to be. Then you look at the pattern again, the way relationships started, the way they ended, the way people were left behind, the way narratives were shaped in the media. It all feels very calculated to some people. Even the way Mary Shackelford was portrayed publicly, she went from being part of Steve's life to suddenly being labeled difficult, unstable, bitter. And once that label sticks, people stop listening to your side. And if that narrative was influenced or guided, that's a different conversation entirely. Now add in the whole situation with Lori Harvey again, because people are watching how she moves too. Her relationships, her public image, the way she transitions from one high profile partner to another, it all feeds into that same idea that there's strategy behind everything. And when Katt said Marjorie is teaching her how to maintain a certain lifestyle through relationships, that's the part that really divided people. Some thought it was disrespectful. Others thought, wait, is there truth in that? Because when you step back and look at everything as a whole, it does start to feel less random and more intentional. Now, does that mean every single thing Katt said is 100% accurate? Nobody can prove that completely. But what he did do is force people to look at things they weren't questioning before. He made people re-examine timelines, relationships, decisions, and public narratives. And once you start doing that, it's hard to go back to just accepting the surface level story. And that's why this whole situation keeps living on. It's not just drama, it's curiosity. It's people trying to figure out what's real and what's just image. Because in Hollywood, those two things are rarely the same. So now the question isn't just about who's right or wrong between Steve and Katt. It's bigger than that. It's whether Steve Harvey is actually in control of his own narrative, or if Marjorie Harvey is the one quietly shaping everything from behind the scenes. And once that question is in the air, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers